You're clearing the fence line and then you spot it. 3 shiny leaves. Poison ivy. Every instinct says rip it out. Gloves on, bag it, burn it. But here's what nobody tells you. 75 bird species need that exact vine to survive winter. Its berries are the last food left when everything else goes bare. You see, you're not looking at a hazard. You're looking at a bird feeder that built itself. The popular understanding of poison ivy runs on a handful of half-truths repeated so often that they've calcified into fact. To get this right, we need to understand 3 separate things that usually get blurred under one umbrella of this statement, that is, poison ivy is simply bad. So, the first one we need to understand is the actual chemical mechanism of the rash caused by the poison ivy. Number 2, the genuine and still growing severity of the threat as our climate changes. And 3, the substantial, well-documented ecological role that this plant plays for wildlife that has nothing to do with how dangerous it is to use specifically. All 3 things are true, but none of them cancel each other out. Let's get some things straight right off the bat. So, despite the name, poison ivy isn't an ivy at all. It belongs to the genus Toxicodendron, literally poison tree in Greek, within the family Anacardiaceae, which makes it a close relative of cashews, pistachios, and mangoes. For most of the 18th and 19th centuries, it was classified under the genus Rus, alongside the harmless sumacs. And it wasn't formally separated into its own distinct genus until botanists in the 1930s argued that the chemical and morphological differences were significant enough to warrant the split. What's now generally recognized in North America is a complex of 2 closely related species, Toxicodendron radicans, the climbing vine common in the east of the Rockies, and Toxicodendron rydbergii, a non-climbing shrub found from most of the rest of the continent, alongside a third species called T. orientale, which is native to East Asia. It's worth being precise about how widely this plant's range actually extends, because the scale of it is part of why the danger and the ecological value both matter at population scale rather than as a backyard curiosity. Toxicodendron radicans is found throughout eastern Canada and the United States, into Mexico and Central Asia, and even in Bermuda and the Bahamas, while the related non-climbing T. rydbergii covers nearly the rest of North America outside the southeastern states. It's also been deliberately and accidentally introduced well outside its native range. Established populations now exist in parts of Europe, South Africa, and elsewhere, in some cases becoming genuinely invasive and producing the same contact dermatitis reports far from where the plant evolved. The leaves of 3 rule that almost everyone learns as a child is a genuinely useful starting heuristic, but it's worth knowing that it's incomplete. Each leaf is a compound structure of exactly 3 leaflets, that's true, with the center leaf being typically on a slightly longer stalk than the 2 side leaves. It's a small but pretty reliable identifying detail, but plenty of harmless plants share the exact same 3-leaf pattern. That includes stuff like wild raspberry, strawberry, box elder seedlings, which means that the rule alone isn't a safe identification method on its own. The more reliable additional cues are the plant's hairy, rootlet-covered climbing vines when mature. Another telltale sign is the small, waxy berries, a detail worth remembering precisely because most poisonous plants in popular imagination would have colorful, obviously alarming fruit, right? But this one doesn't, they're just small and white. The compound responsible for essentially the entire reputation of this plant is called urushiol. It's not a single molecule, but a mixture of closely related catechol compounds, each with a long carbohydrate side chain that can be saturated and carry 1, 2, or 3 double bonds. Now, urushiol is present in the entire plant, the leaves, stems, roots, and berries alike, and the functions, as far as botanists can tell, primarily as a wound-sealing resin, much like how sap functions in other plants when bark or tissue is damaged. It is not, notably, a defense mechanism aimed at deterring being eaten. We'll get to that shortly, but it does essentially have nothing to do with stopping animals from eating the plant at all. The entire, often fatal feeling human reaction in a real biochemical sense is that our immune system is overreacting to a molecule that isn't even trying to hurt us. Genetic research also confirms something that helps explain why this plant has become a persistent fixture in North American landscapes specifically. In 2020, researchers completed and published a full genome sequence of toxicodendron radicans, providing the clearest picture yet of how the plant's urushiol producing biosynthetic pathway evolved. Work the researchers note is increasingly relevant given how aggressively the plant's range and potency have been expanding in recent decades. That's a trend that we're going to examine shortly in the video. Now, here's a detail that will surprise almost everybody, including people who have had poison ivy a dozen of times. Urushiol itself is not actually toxic in the way that the venom or the true plant poisons are toxic. On its own, sitting in a test tube, it is immunologically inert. The rash you develop isn't urushiol damaging your skin directly. It's a textbook case of what immunologists called type 4 or delayed type hypersensitivity reaction. Basically, it means that the mechanism behind it is genuinely elegant, in the same way that a lot of immune system failures are elegant right up until they're happening to you. The urushiol touches the skin, it begins penetrating within roughly 10 to 20 minutes, fast enough that washing it off within about an hour can meaningfully reduce or even prevent a reaction entirely, but slow enough that almost nobody manages it in real-world conditions. Once inside the skin, the catechol groups in urushiol are oxidized by exposure to oxygen in a far more reactive form called quinone. Now, these quinones aren't content to stay where they landed. They bind covalently to proteins in your skin, in particular to lysine residues on those proteins, permanently altering them at a molecular level. Now, this is a crucial step because your immune system doesn't recognize urushiol as a threat at all. It recognizes a new hybrid model that your own skin protein chemically modified by the quinone has something foreign. Now, specialized immune cells called Langerhans cells, which patrol the skin specifically looking for unfamiliar molecular shapes, pick up this altered protein, internalize it, and migrate it to the nearest lymph node. There, they present a fragment of it to T lymphocytes, training a subset of those T cells to recognize the urushiol protein complex specifically. Those trained T cells then circulate back to the skin, orchestrate the inflammatory attack that actually produces the redness, swelling, and blistering. That training step is why the very first exposure in a person's life almost never produces a rash at all. The immune system hasn't built a targeted mechanism yet. It's also why reactions tend to get faster and sometimes more severe with significant subsequent exposure as the trained T cell population grows. And it explains one of the most commonly misunderstood claims about the rash. It cannot spread across your body the way that an infection spreads. What looks like spreading almost always is either delayed onset on areas that received a smaller initial dose of oil, or more often a secondary transfer where the oil is still sitting on hands, clothing, or under fingernails, and then get moved to new areas of skin hours or even days after the initial contact. Current estimates suggest nowhere between 50 and 85% of adults will react to urushiol exposure to some kind of meaningful degree, with research indicating that it isn't a fixed trait. Sensitivity can change over a person's lifetime, and a small percentage of people, somewhere around 15% by some estimates, appear to be genuinely non-reactive regardless of exposure. Now, nobody fully understands why that minority exists. Now, it is worth distinguishing this kind of skin contact mechanism from a separate, much rarer, but much more serious pathway, which is ingesting it. Because urushiol is a potent irritant to mucous membranes, generally not on skin. Accidentally or deliberately consuming any part of the plant can cause severe inflammation and damage throughout the digestive tract and airway, and this would warrant emergency care rather than home treatment. Now, it is uncommon since the plant isn't something that people would typically mistake for food, but it does underscore a point that's worth repeating throughout this story, is that urushiol's danger isn't confined to one tidy, predictable mode of contact. It finds multiple routes into the body, and each one produces a genuinely different clinical picture. Now, the English name itself dates back to one of the earliest written records of European contact with the plant. In 1609, the explorer Captain John Smith best known today for his association with the Jamestown colony, encountered the vine in Virginia and, struck by its resemblance to English ivy he knew from home, he gave it the name that stuck around for more than 400 years afterwards. He elaborated on it more fully in his own 1624 account describing the poison weed. He said that even though it is shaped much like the English ivy, it causes redness, itching, and blisters on contact, adding that in language that reads almost dismissively today, that the symptoms passed on their own after a while, where the plant, in his own words, were of no ill nature. Now, native peoples of the land had already been familiar with the plant's effects long before John Smith's arrival, and used that traditional knowledge to avoid it and to be carefully selective about what kind of plants to use for medicinal and practical uses. The taxonomic history carries its own small drama, though. For roughly 2 centuries after Linnaeus first classified it, poison ivy sat under the genus Rus alongside true sumacs. The name Toxicodendron actually existed even earlier, coined by French botanist Joseph Pitton de Tournefort, before Linnaeus's own system was established, but it took until the 1930s with detailed taxonomic treatises that specifically examined Anacredaceae family before botanists broadly accepted the separating of urushiol producing species into their own genus, a reclassification that notably generated genuine published scientific disagreement and rebuttal amongst botanists for decades afterwards. Now, one of the stranger chapters in the history is the long, largely failed scientific attempt to find a constructive use for the plant. In the late 1700s, French army physician named André Ignace Joseph Dufresne had poison ivy specimens shipped to him from the Americas, and he spent years attempting to boil down the leaves to extract usable medicinal oil, while contemporary French botanists experimented with growing the plant deliberately on European gardens. None of that stuff worked. None of it produced anything close to the medicinal breakthrough that Dufresne was hoping for. But one of the plant's close Asian relatives, in fact, did become genuinely useful to an entire civilization in a way that had nothing to do with medicine at all. The Chinese lacquer tree Toxicodendron varanus flume produces an extremely similar urushiol-rich sap that has been deliberately collected, refined, and used to coat wood and metal objects since prehistoric times in China, with the practice also spreading to and flourishing in Korea and Japan for many centuries. The exact same chemical family that sends an American gardener to urgent care has for thousands of years on the other side of the world been foundational material in one of East Asia's decorative art traditions. Even today, some craftsmen work with dried, fully cured poison ivy vines into wreaths and rustic decor, a practice that requires meticulous, full-coverage protective handling throughout, since the cured vine also carries exactly the same persistent chemical risk that was discussed earlier on in the video. But this is the point in the story where it stops being purely historical and becomes genuinely urgent, because 2 separate, well-documented scientific findings show that this plant getting measurably more dangerous in real time for reasons entirely outside of human control. The first comes from a 6-year study conducted at Duke University Free Air CO2 Enrichment, or FACE, an experiment where researchers grew poison ivy under elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide levels designed to mimic projected mid-century concentrations. Now, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2006, the results were unambiguous, and that was elevated CO2 didn't just make the plants grow faster, it also measurably increased the plant's urushiol output and shifted the chemical mixture itself towards more allergenic forms. A separate follow-up study published in the journal Weed Science, no pun intended, extended this work to a wider gradient of CO2 concentrations, from levels matching the mid-20th century up until the projections for 2019, and found a consistent pattern: rising biomass and rising urushiol content together, scaling with rising CO2. The practical implication, confirmed by researchers tracking the experiment's results, is straightforward and basically not reassuring. And that is, as atmospheric CO2 continues climbing, we should expect even more poison ivy, growing faster, covering more ground, producing oil that's measurably more potent than the version that most of us grew up learning to avoid. This is one of the rarer cases in climate science where mechanism is genuinely simple and direct, rather than being buried in indirect modeling. More atmospheric carbon means more raw material for the plant's own growth and chemistry, with no complicated intermediate steps requiring to explain the result. The second finding concerns a route of exposure most people never even think to worry about. Burning poison ivy releases urushiol in the air, suspended on smoke particles and ash, and inhaling it can cause a reaction inside your lungs rather than on the skin. Now, this well-documented occupational knowledge amongst wildfire fighters and forestry workers is recognized as a leading cause of lost work time and disability within those professions specifically, because of how frequently they encounter the plant in brush fires and active burns. In the most serious cases, the resulting lung inflammation produces real acute respiratory distress. A peer-reviewed case report published in 2022 documented two separate unrelated instances in which urushiol smoke inhalation from burning poison ivy directly caused or contributed cardiopulmonary arrest and death. The Centers for Disease Control, or CDC's own guide for outdoor workers, is unambiguous on one point, and that is do not burn poison ivy, poison oak, or poison sumac under any circumstances. Where burning is genuinely unavoidable, only proceed with proper respiratory protection. And then there's this third, less life-threatening but genuinely surprising piece of persistence research worth knowing. And that is urushiol does not meaningfully degrade simply because the plant it came from has died. The CDC notes that urushiol can remain chemically active on contaminated surfaces like tools, clothing, fences, dead vines themselves for up to 5 years. Documented cases include herbanium species decades long still triggering reactions on contact, and routine seasonal stories of gardeners developing rashes from handling apparently dead, lifeless winter vines that they assumed were safe. The chemistry, in other words, doesn't care whether the plant is alive or dead, it just sits there waiting for skin. But here's the flip side of that story. Urushiol's allergenic effects appear to be essentially unique to humans and our closest primate relatives. So animals like birds, deer, rabbits, and a great majority of mammals basically show no allergic response to it whatsoever. That single biochemical fact is the entire reason that the plant functions in wildlife habitat at all. Deer and rabbits browse the leaves and stems directly as they forage, and at least 75 distinct bird species have been recorded eating the berries, including bobtail quail, multiple woodpecker species, eastern bluebirds, and gray catbirds. The yellow-rumped warbler stands out specifically here because researchers note it's the only warbler species capable of efficiently digesting the waxy coating that's present on poison ivy berries, an ability tied to an unusually high concentration of bile salts in its digestive system. And this specific dietary flexibility is one of the documented reasons that this species can winter significantly farther north than most other North American warbler species often found in Newfoundland. Now, the berries themselves ripen specifically in the fall and persist into winter, precisely the season where most other fruit sources have already been stripped out or frozen, meaning that poison ivy functions as a genuine seasonal bridge for birds that are attempting to survive the leanest months of the year. Even the plant's small, inconspicuous spring flowers play a documented ecological role beyond birds entirely, drawing bees, beetles, flies, wasps, ants, and butterflies as pollinators throughout the growing season. Now, we talked a lot about the plant's biology, its genus, its historical implications, so what do we do with all of this information? What do you do with a vine like this if it appears on a fence post? Now, you need to start by asking yourself a very important question, and that is, does the poison ivy appear to be somewhere where there's a real risk of exposure to people or your pets? Or is it somewhere where you normally don't go? You see, a vine growing along the back fence line is probably a low-traffic part of your property, away from play areas, walking paths, and pet access. And in this case, it can reasonably be just left alone. And that's because of the wildlife value that we documented earlier in the video with scientific data and proof points. I mean, doing this costs you nothing in maintenance, since the plant requires basically no care to keep producing in the fall and winter as a good food source for your birds nearby. But here's another scenario. You find a poison ivy vine climbing near a doorway. or near your children's play area, or a garden bed where you work regularly, or anywhere where you frequently have foot traffic. In those cases, the calculation is completely different, and in those cases, removal is a reasonable, evidence backed choice. If removal is the right call, the science gives us a very clear set of rules. Never burn it. That's the most important thing. And also check local guidelines or the approved way of disposing poison ivy. You can contact your local authorities to find out. Also, you must wear genuinely impermeable gloves, specifically nitrile or heavy rubber rather than the standard fabric or thin latex gloves, since urushiol can penetrate through some glove materials with extended contact. You should also carefully wash all your tools, dispose of any gloves, or maybe wash them out carefully, and any clothing that may have come in contact with a plant in hot water and genuinely degreasing detergent immediately afterwards. And if exposure happens anyway, then the most evidence backed first response is thoroughly washing with soap and water within the first hour, since that's the window when intervention can meaningfully reduce how much oil penetrates your skin. A more practical detail worth knowing, though, is that the genuinely common secondary exposure pathway, which is pets. You see, cats and dogs themselves probably never will develop a rash to exposure to poison ivy because they have the same general immunity as deer and other mammals. However, they can brush against poison ivy and have some of that oil on their fur, and when you're going to groom them or touch them or play with them, it means that a member of your household or even your kids could end up with exposure, and that is a very dangerous position to be. So, if you suspect that your pet or your cat and dog has been exposed to poison ivy, the best thing to do is a bath with pet-safe shampoo before significant household contact resumes in a reasonable low-cost precaution. Now, with all of that being said, let's go back to that fence post. The honest answer to what's growing on it was a never simple leave it or destroy it kind of vibe. It's both entirely dependent on what's growing and who's likely to touch it. Is it in a high traffic area? Because that's a more genuinely useful way to think about this plant rather than having this blanket fear that most people carry, or the blanket reassurance of a tidier version that there's a very easy solution to fixing this. What's actually true is backed by chemistry papers tracing down a molecule to the exact protein bonds that forms on your skin. And then on the other hand, ornithology research names 75 specific bird species that need exactly the poison ivy berries that you would have destroyed otherwise. You see, both things can be true at the same time. It can be dangerous to you if it's in a high traffic area, and it is very important to the ecological system. Both things are true. So, whether you should destroy the poison ivy or stay away from it and just let it be, depends entirely on where the poison ivy is. So use your best judgment, get the information that you need from this video about the proper waste disposal for poison ivy and what you should do, but also understanding the scientific content and the knowledge behind this is very important. Thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you on the next one.